Most disciplined people will never build wealth, not because they lack effort, but because they were handed an incomplete principle and told it was the whole truth. They were taught to earn more, spend less, and repeat, and somewhere in that cycle, they confused motion with architecture. Solomon observed something different. In Proverbs 21:20, he drew a quiet but absolute distinction between the wise man who stores and the foolish man who devours everything he has. And the difference was not discipline. It was reservation. Discipline without a structured reserve is not a wealth strategy. It is a performance. If you have spent years being financially responsible and still cannot point to something untouched, something held deliberately apart from the cycle of your daily financial life, then what you have built is not architecture. It is circulation. If that challenges something you believe about money, stay until the end. There is a man you already know. He wakes before his alarm. He tracks every dollar. He declines dinners he cannot afford, skips vacations he has not budgeted for, and reads the kind of books that promise clarity about money. He is, by every visible measure, disciplined, and he is not wealthy, not because he lacks effort, not because he lacks knowledge, not because the system failed him or fate intervened. He is not wealthy because he was given an incomplete map. He was handed a set of behaviors, saving, spending less, earning more, and told that if he followed them with enough consistency, something called financial freedom would eventually appear. It has not appeared. It will not appear. Not through discipline alone. This is not a criticism of that man. It is an observation about a wider misunderstanding, one so deeply embedded in modern culture that most people never think to question it. The assumption is this, that if you are rigorous enough with your income, if you work long enough, sacrifice enough, and stay focused enough, Solomon did not believe that. Solomon did not believe that. And Solomon, by any reasonable historical account, understood wealth more precisely than almost any figure the ancient world produced. Consider what contemporary culture has done with the concept of financial discipline. It has turned discipline into a performance. There are budgets displayed publicly, savings rates announced in conversations, sacrifices documented and celebrated. The disciplined person today is often someone who is visibly managing money, tracking it, moving it, optimizing it, as though the activity of financial management were itself the destination. It is not the destination. What modern thinking has quietly confused is motion with structure, movement with architecture. The disciplined, salaried worker moves money constantly. He earns, allocates, spends, invests in modest amounts, and repeats the cycle every 30 days. He is always in motion. The money is always in motion. But motion does not build. Motion circulates. There is a profound difference between a river and a reservoir. The river is always moving. It looks impressive. It sounds impressive, but it does not hold. The moment the source stops flowing, the river disappears. A reservoir, by contrast, holds what has been directed into it, quietly, without spectacle, and from that reserve, entire cities drink. The disciplined earner is almost always a river. The wealthy family, the one that does not advertise its wealth, the one whose name appears in documents and deeds rather than on social media, is almost always a reservoir. This distinction is not incidental. It is structural, and it is ancient. In Proverbs 21:20, Solomon wrote something that most readers pass through too quickly. He observed that, in the dwelling of the wise, there are stores of choice, food, and oil. But the foolish man, he said, devours all he has. Read that slowly, because the wealth principle is not hidden. It is simply quiet. The wise man stores. Not because he fears scarcity, not because he is anxious about the future. He stores because storing is an expression of a particular relationship with resources, one that is patient, structural, and long in its vision. The foolish man and the word Solomon uses here is not careless. The foolish man does not waste in the obvious sense. He is not necessarily extravagant. He simply consumes everything available to him. He uses what he earns. He applies what he saves. He deploys what he accumulates. He devours thoroughly, completely, without remainder. That is the distinction. Not discipline versus laziness. Not wisdom versus ignorance. The distinction is between a man who leaves something untouched and a man who does not. Generations understood this law. Ancient households, merchant families, landowners, builders of multi-generational influence, did not simply practice discipline. They practiced reservation. They maintained a portion of their resources that was structurally separated from the rest, not to be touched, not to be used, not to be optimized. Simply held. That holding was not passivity. It was architecture. Now, Name the assumption that most disciplined people carry into their financial lives. The assumption is, if I manage well enough, I will eventually have enough left over. Enough left over to invest. Enough left over to give. Enough left over to stop worrying. But leftover is the wrong structure entirely. Leftover implies that the remainder is what survives the cycle, that after living, spending, and obligating, something remains, and that remainder becomes the foundation of wealth. This is the exact reversal of what Solomon describes. In the ancient model, nothing is left over. Something is reserved. These are not synonyms. They describe entirely different architectures. Leftover is accidental. It is what survives consumption. It changes every month, every season, every unexpected expense. It is vulnerable to mood, circumstance, and temptation. When there is a little more is spent. When there is pressure, the leftover shrinks. It is the first thing to disappear. Reserved is intentional. It is allocated before consumption begins. It is structurally protected from the daily cycle of income and expense. It does not respond to mood. It is not visible in the daily account. It does not fluctuate with temptation because it is not accessible to temptation. This is the mechanism, not a theory, not a philosophy in the abstract. A structural decision made before any other financial decision is made. This is what is called the law of reserved capital. The law of reserved capital is not complex in its description. What makes it rare is not its difficulty. What makes it rare is what it requires of the person who practices it. It requires that you withhold from yourself, consistently, before you know what you will need. Not after you have paid your obligations. Before, not what you hope to have remaining. A disciplined portion, allocated with intention, placed where your daily thinking cannot access it, and left there, not invested, in the active sense. Not deployed. Held. The first structural layer of this law is deceptively simple. Reserve before reward. In every financial cycle, weekly, monthly. However, income arrives. The first allocation is not to expenses, not to savings goals, not to investment accounts. The first allocation is to the reserve. A portion goes to a place that is structurally separated from your operating life, and it goes there first. Before groceries? Before rent? Before any of the legitimate obligations that feel urgent. This is not a budgeting technique. This is an identity statement. It says, in practical form, this portion of what I produce is not available for consumption. It does not exist in the transactional sense. It is not a savings account that can be accessed when something desirable appears. It is a reserve. Its only function is to exist, untouched, and to grow through that very untouched nature. The practical application of this is not dramatic. Consider a household earning a regular income, not a high income, a regular one. Before the month's expenses are calculated, a percentage is allocated to a separate account. Not 10%, not in some rigid scriptural formula, but a deliberate percentage. Decided in advance, transferred immediately upon income arrival, and thereafter treated as though it does not exist. 40% is not unreasonable for those who have examined their obligations honestly. 20% is a beginning. The number matters less than the structure. What changes is not the amount. What changes is the sequence. Here is where the identity shock arrives. Most disciplined people who encounter this principle respond with a quiet but certain objection. I already do something like this. I save. I have accounts. I track my spending. I have a system. And they are right. They have a system. But their system is built on what remains. Their reserve, if it exists at all, is downstream of their decisions. It is what survives the month. That means it is, in every meaningful sense, an afterthought dressed in the language of intention but functioning as a consolation. Discipline without reservation is hollow. The disciplined person who has not structured a true reserve is performing financial virtue without building financial architecture. He feels the effort. He sees the sacrifice. He experiences the restraint. But the effort does not compound. The sacrifice does not accumulate. The restraint does not amplify. It circulates. He earns, manages, spends, with care, and arrives at each new month approximately where he began, slightly more informed, slightly more organized, but not materially different in the way that matters most. This is not a failure of character. It is a failure of structure. And structure, unlike character, can be corrected in a single decision made on a single afternoon. There is something else beneath the surface of this law. Something that most people, even after understanding the concept, do not immediately grasp. The reserve does not simply accumulate money, it accumulates something quieter and more durable. As Solomon observed, in the dwelling of the wise there are stores, The stores are not simply the food and the oil. The stores are the evidence of a particular kind of mind. They are proof that the person who built them operates from a different relationship with time. They are proof that the future has already been given weight in the present. They are proof of patience, not as a personality trait, but as a structural practice. The reserve that is never touched begins to do something unusual in the life of the person who holds it. It changes how that person makes decisions. When a financial choice must be made, an investment, an obligation, an opportunity, the person without a reserve is always calculating from scarcity. Every decision is made with the awareness that all available resources are needed, that there is no margin, that choosing one thing means losing another. The person with a true reserve calculates differently. Not because they are wealthier in income, they may earn less, but they carry a margin. And that margin, that quiet, untouched portion, gives every decision a different quality. It introduces patience where urgency once lived. It replaces desperation with discernment. This is only the first layer. What sits beneath it, what the reserve actually becomes over years and across generations, is something the ancient world understood and the modern world has almost entirely forgotten. Generations understood this law. And what they understood was not simply financial. It was structural. It was architectural. It was in the deepest sense an expression of identity. Discipline alone whispers in the present. Reserved capital speaks across generations. What that means precisely, practically, and in full is where this continues. The reserve is not a savings account. Repeat that slowly, because the distinction carries the entire weight of what follows. A savings account is a holding space for money you intend to use. You save for a purpose, a purchase, a transition, an emergency, a goal. The money sits temporarily, and then it is deployed. The account empties, the cycle resets. This is not a criticism of saving. Saving is responsible. Saving is better than not saving, but saving is not reserving. The reserve, in the structure Solomon describes, has no intended use. That is not a careless omission. That is the design. Money allocated without a designated purpose, held with intention and left structurally untouched, begins to operate according to a different logic than money held for a reason. Money held for a reason is patient only until the reason arrives. The moment the purpose appears, the money moves. It was always going to move. Its patience was conditional. Reserved capital has unconditional patience. It does not wait for a purpose. It waits. And in that waiting, something accumulates that is not easily measured in currency. The second structural layer of the law of reserved capital is this. Patient accumulation changes the architecture of choice. This requires some examination. Most people understand wealth through the lens of quantity. More money means more options. Less money means fewer options. This is true in the obvious sense, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. What actually expands with a true reserve is not simply purchasing power. It is the quality of decisions made from a position of structural patience. Consider the merchants. Both earn the same annual income. Both are disciplined. Both manage their households with care. The first merchant saves what remains after his expenses, reinvests with diligence, and maintains a visible prosperity. The second merchant, before any expense is calculated, allocates a fixed portion to a reserve that he treats as structurally absent from his financial life. Over time, his visible prosperity may appear less impressive than the first merchant's. He spends less. He invests in smaller amounts from his remaining income. But after a decade, the second merchant holds something the first does not. He holds a capital reserve that has never been touched. It has never responded to an opportunity that felt urgent. It has never been partially liquidated during a difficult season. It has never been redirected toward a promising investment. It is simply held, and in holding, it has become the structural foundation of every decision he makes. When a significant opportunity arrives, a property, a partnership, a position that requires committed capital, the first merchant must calculate carefully. He must weigh the opportunity against his current obligations, his active investments, his operating needs. He moves carefully because he cannot afford to move poorly. The second merchant consults his reserve, not because he will use it, but because its existence changes the geometry of his decision. He knows something is held in reserve. That knowledge produces a quality of calm that is not performative. It is structural. He is not pretending to be patient. He is structurally capable of patience because he has built patience into the architecture of his financial life. This is what the wise man's stores actually represent in Solomon's framing. Not abundance for its own sake. Not the vanity of accumulation. Structural patience. The ability to wait without anxiety, to consider without urgency, to act without desperation. The wise prepare before the reward. Control precedes abundance. Now consider the psychological dimension of what this practice produces over time. Most people experience their financial lives as a continuous negotiation between what they want and what they have. Every month is a calculation. Every income is immediately spoken for. The money arrives, and before it has fully settled, it is already designated rent, food, transportation, obligations, small pleasures, modest savings. By the end of the cycle, the person is waiting for the next cycle to begin. This is not poverty. This is the structure of the financially disciplined earner who has no reserve. His identity is tied to the management of flow. He is proud of the flow. He tracks the flow. He has optimized the flow to a considerable degree. But the flow defines him. He is a person in constant relationship with money, attending to it, responding to it, making decisions about it on a near daily basis. The person with a true reserve reaches a quiet threshold where the relationship changes. The reserve is not attended to. It does not require daily management. It does not produce anxiety. It does not respond to external pressure. It simply exists, held apart, structurally protected from the concerns of the operational week. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the person's identity begins to separate from the movement of money. This is a psychological reframe that most people never reach, not because they lack intelligence, but because they were never shown what the destination looks like. Wealth is not a feeling produced by a high balance in an operational account. Wealth is the settled quality of a person who has built structural reserve into the architecture of their life. It is an identity, a posture, a relationship with time that is fundamentally different from the one most disciplined people carry. Discipline without reservation is hollow. Discipline with reservation becomes identity. There is a quiet, social observation worth making here. Families who have held wealth across generations, not celebrities, not public figures, not the performatively affluent, but quiet families whose names appear in land records and legal documents across decades, almost never display their wealth as activity. They do not hustle visibly. They do not announce their system. They do not optimize publicly. Their financial lives are, to the outside observer, almost unremarkable. They live within their means. They spend modestly relative to what they hold. They are not impressed by urgency. This is not accidental modesty. It is structural. When a reserve has been maintained across years and past with intention across generations, the family that holds it does not experience money as something to be constantly managed. They experience it as something that is structurally present. It does not require their daily attention because it is not in motion. It holds. And in holding, it grants the family a posture that busy, active, disciplined earners do not possess. That posture is discretion, silence, the quiet authority of people who are never in a hurry. Because they have already built something that does not require speed, wealth waits in quiet corners. It does not announce itself. It does not need to. The modern cultural worship of activity, of visible effort, public sacrifice, documented discipline is in many ways the opposite of what the ancient household understood. Busy work does not equate to power. Strategic reserve does. The family that is always in motion is demonstrating, through that very motion, that it has not yet reached stillness, that it is still managing, still optimizing, still negotiating with circumstance. The family that has built a true reserve has crossed a threshold. It is no longer negotiating with circumstance. It is, quietly and without announcement, arranging it. The daily practice that supports this is not dramatic. It is precisely the opposite. Each time income arrives, before the operational accounting begins, a single transfer is made. A designated amount decided in advance, not in the moment, moves to a structurally separate account. An account that is not linked to a debit card. An account that does not appear in the daily banking interface. An account that is, for all practical purposes of daily life, absent. The transfer happens first. Not after obligations are met, first. This single sequence, reserve before reward, is the daily ritual through which the principle becomes practice. It is not meditative. It is not ceremonial. It is structural. It is the behavioral expression of a decision that has already been made about what kind of relationship you will have with your own resources. Over time, this sequence becomes unremarkable. The reserve grows quietly. It does not celebrate milestones. It does not provide monthly satisfaction reports. It simply accumulates, slowly, structurally, without urgency. And the person who maintains it begins, almost without noticing, to make different decisions. Not because the reserve has grown large enough to be deployed, but because its presence, untouched, patient, structurally held, has begun to change the architecture of thought. Wealth grows in silence, not activity. The unseen portion compounds power. A calm warning deserves space here. Impatience is not a moral failing. It is the natural response of a person who has been taught that money should always be working, always moving, always producing visible returns. The culture of financial optimization is deeply impatient. It rewards activity. It rewards visible progress. It makes stillness feel like negligence. The reserve will feel, in its early months, like a mistake. Nothing visible will happen. The operational account will be smaller. The investment amounts from remaining income will be more modest. There will be moments when the reserve feels like a weight rather than a foundation, money sitting without purpose, seemingly idle, while other people are deploying capital and announcing results. This is the discipline test, not the test of whether you can track a budget, not the test of whether you can resist a purchase, the test of whether you can tolerate structural patience in a culture that cannot. As Solomon observed, the wise hold their stores. They are not moved by the urgency of the season. They are not seduced by the visible activity of the foolish man who devours what he earns with admirable energy and thoroughness. They hold, and holding, over years, produces something that no amount of optimized activity can replicate. It produces a person who is no longer defined by what they earn. Identity, not income, defines the rich. Generations understood this law. And the evidence of that identity is not found in the operational account, the one that moves and responds and fills and empties with the rhythm of modern financial life. It is found in the reserve, the quiet portion, the untouched stores that speak, without words, of a mind that has learned to think beyond the present month. Discipline alone whispers in the present. Reserved capital speaks across generations. Solomon did not write about wealth as a destination to be reached through sufficient effort. He described it as an architecture to be built through structural patience, through the quiet, consistent decision to hold before consuming, to reserve before rewarding, to protect what is most durable from what is most urgent. The man who wakes before his alarm, tracks every dollar, and still finds himself arriving at each new month approximately where he began, is not failing because he lacks effort. He is failing because he was given only half of the map. The other half is not complicated, it is not secret. It is not available only to those with high incomes or inherited advantages. It is a structural decision, made once with clarity and maintained daily with a single transfer, that begins quietly, without announcement, to change the architecture of a life. This is the law of reserve capital, not a technique, not a trend. A timeless principle, observed by the wisest man the ancient world recorded, that has never stopped being true. Control precedes abundance. The wise prepare before the reward. Wealth waits in quiet corners. And now, having understood this, the question is not whether you believe it, the question is whether you will build it. Like this video if you think differently about wealth now. Subscribe for more ancient wealth principles. Comment, reserved if you are ready to build the architecture.